the cow path to misinformation. And I think that's also appropriate to think about. I've just thought that's a real on-point way to describe the way we access information these days. In earlier times, you had to go to the library, which I'm sure the librarians in the Zoom room here love. These days, you can stay in your dorm room as a student or in your office as a faculty member or administrator, and it's all just a Google search away. There's no navigating the wilderness in person as much, but it's very much, again, I think a cow path to misinformation if you're not aware of the fact that not everything you see out there in the wild is reliable. And that's kind of agnostic to personal belief or politics or anything at all like that. It's just purely, there's a lot out there, and maybe the sources aren't as sound or reliable as they used to be. When I think about information wilderness, I think you have to not trust and then verify. You have to verify everything before you can trust it. And that used to not be the case. You used to, as a young guy, I used to be able to go to the library, check out an encyclopedia, and know that was vetted information. These days, helping my kids, they're a little older now, but here they are, helping little guys and girls, their book report isn't go to the library, check out an encyclopedia, it's fire up the web browser, Google search, and then start gathering sources. And they don't know yet, because they haven't had a librarian tell them differently yet, because they're young, second, third grade. Some sources are just not reliable. And truly for me, I do think back to that, in the woods by Mount Hood, stepping through the thorns, kicking a rock by accident. It's wild. It's going to be rough going. I think it's a very appropriate way to frame the question. So that's kind of my initial thoughts. I'd love to hear from others.
Well, anyone else can feel free to jump in. I don't want to be the center of the conversation. We invited you all here because we'd love to hear you speak on that. But if anyone else has any thoughts about that.
Yeah, Brian, I like that you really connected with the wilderness analogy. I grew up in Oregon, but I've never been an outdoor person. Just never have been. I in my head, I want to be. I'm just not. And so, but what I think about, I do love food though, and that's what I think about when I'm thinking about the information. And right now, instead of like when I think of wilderness, I think of, because I'm not an outdoor person, I think of like scarcity, right? I think of like, I don't have water, I'm thirsty, I don't have what I need, I get scared thinking about it. And what I think about right now from an information perspective is like, there's so much, it's like a buffet, but it's all the food and it's all the junk food and it's all the flashy, it's all the donuts with the sprinkles and all of this really flashy good things and the pizzas and this and that and this and that, but it's not all the food, right? It's not all the things that we should be consuming. So we're eating it because it looks good and flashy and it's pretty, and it seems like it's the food that we want or need, but we're consuming it and we're not actually getting the nutritional value. So we're not getting the real stuff, the stuff that we really want, but it's just everywhere, right? Like we're even thinking of like Hansel and Gretel, right? We're like in the candy house, like everything is made of candy, and trying to find those nuggets of like, where's the vegetables? Where's the real food? Where's the meat? Where's the stuff that I'm supposed to? I've been tasked to create a balanced plate, but I'm in a house made of candy. Where do I find those things? So rather than, again, my brain going to the idea of wilderness, of being scarcity, I feel like I'm just surrounded. There's still scarcity in some respects, but it doesn't feel like that because I'm surrounded by so many tempting things. And we live in such a clickbait world, right? That is geared towards me, and specifically geared towards me and wanting to give me the information that I think I want, but isn't really the true accurate information. It is not actually moving me towards building the plate that I've been tasked to build.
I really like that food analogy, Amber. Thank you for that. That's great.
I wish I could do the outdoor thing, but
I'm reminded of kind of two thoughts on the wilderness. One is just the thought of, at one time you had the gatekeepers, right? And to compare it, like they were your guides taking you in the wilderness, and they were taking you on a path, and it was a predictable path, and it was a codified path, and people had made sure the paths were going where you knew they were supposed to go, and there was a trustworthiness. And now navigating that wilderness means navigating all of the above, which is just different. And so in the vacuum of the guides, like what has stepped in? And the answer is, it's been filter bubbles and algorithms, and we have a generation being shaped in their worldview by algorithm, and by algorithm that gets narrower and narrower and narrower, and that your Overton window gets shifted further and further and further toward the side that you agree, but also more extreme. And in the process, to use the wilderness metaphor, you begin to view all of reality as just the trees that are immediately around you, and that's your filter bubble. And you forget there's actually a whole different landscape elsewhere, right? And so it's not just that there's some dangers and stuff, but there's this element of perspective that you sometimes lose, I feel like, because you're so stuck in this thicket that you forget that there's actually other views out there that are really important to know that you could be missing, because you just found your way through the wilderness in a way that you think is fully you, but it's actually been shaped by this unknown force, right? Like I pop into, I compare it to those little like sprites in the movie Brave, right? That just takes takes her away. I don't know. I have a whole decade of movies that are like genuine, amazing movies that I never saw because I had little kids at the time. So I have like these Pixar and Disney movies etched in my mind, but.
Well, that's great, John. Actually, you and Amber both are getting us great into our next topic, which is attention. So how do things capture our attention? We've kind of started to get into that already. But also, what do we think is the effect of this? So we're saying that our attention has been fractured, and we're all kind of seeing only the trees in front of us, the thing that's most appealing to us, our candy. So how can we give our attention to more diverse perspectives? Is there anything that we can do to push against these forces that are putting us only with exactly what we want to see and they think we already believe? And I thought, Amber, as a clinical psychologist, that might be a really good place for you to start.
Sure. I don't want to step on. John, did you have something you wanted to say first, though?
Oh, no, it's fine. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to jump in.
No, go for it.
All right. I'll just say something real quick about that, which is like, I think that one of the dangers of attention and social media in particular is the way that it's added metrics to things that never had metrics before, right? Relationships, things like that. I don't come from a clinical psychology background or anything, but I was always very worried when I taught middle school of watching kids getting really worried about likes and numbers, and never had numbers been attached to that, right? Like as a kid, I just would have been like, my friend count would have been 1. Like it would have been Matt. That would have been it. But then also the attention side is, because they're trying to vie for your attention, like one of the scariest things is people who go to social media to avoid anything that is social or political are getting brief snippets of very biased information and internalizing that as true without even reading on it. And like, I don't post political things on Facebook, and neither does my mom, right? But I get blue Facebook, she gets red Facebook. Why? Because I mention watching Parks and Rec and The Good Place. She mentions watching Blue Bloods and NCIS, And now, based on the algorithm, she's getting a bunch of Fox News. I'm getting MSNBC and NPR. And without reading any of the articles, you're just quick attention getting these spurts of headlines at you as you scroll. And there have been moments with my own kids that I'm realizing, like, they're influenced by meme culture. Like, they get their news via memes. And memes that they follow that are humorous, and then suddenly there's a political bias that's introduced, and it's rapid fire. So I'll stop and just share your thoughts, Amber. I didn't mean to.
No, not at all. I mean, it's really in line with what I was going to say is the same thing that we're in this time where information is, and we're already socioculturally have been pulled to a place of extremes, and we've been pulled to nothing is moderate or balanced anymore, and even when there is a bipartisan moderate perspective, it's almost rejected immediately. Like we're seeking out these extreme things. Not only are we seeking it out, but we're seeking it out because that's what we're being exposed to more and more and more and more and more. And so again, our attention is being drawn towards more of those things, and we're seeking that out. And again, it's not even just the information, but going to the algorithm, right? Where even the information that we are seeking, if I put this into the Google search, if I put the exact same search term in Google that Bryce puts in, it's going to come up with two different top hits. We're going to have different outcomes to the same exact search term in the same exact search engine, and that we are not just being able to have free access to all information. We're not all getting the same things, that there are these back workings and algorithms that are coming into play that are impacting all of our lives and our ability to have unbiased information or be able to have access to differing points of view. And you asked a little bit about kind of the diversity piece, and I think that's something that I've been really attending to when it comes to my exposure to all of the things. Like COVID has introduced me to new things, and the kids do the TikTok. So I opened up the TikTok app, right? And TikTok's all about an algorithm. It starts it tries to learn and figure out who you are, and then try to show you more videos of things that reflect you back to you, right? And so it tries to learn you and learn about you. And as I was thinking about that and thinking about how that relates to, like, again, the information, it's not just our searches, it's not just this, it's all of our like media exposure and things that we're taking in are kind of being governed by that backhand algorithm. And so when I think about diversity and trying to get exposed to different experiences and different points of view, I think about TikTok. And I think about, like, how can I trick TikTok to think I'm something else? Think I'm not. If I can start to get different kinds of content that is so unrelated to me, then I'm doing something that is showing that I'm giving attention to some different perspectives. Once TikTok starts to think that I am, Samoan, I get a lot of Polynesian stuff. So once they start to think I'm Polynesian, okay, look, I've started shifting and looking at what's kind of bringing my attention. What am I kind of exposing myself to, giving attention to, that's maybe different than the perspective that I always do. Now, can I shift it again? What kinds of things can I spend more time on that offers another perspective? And of course, TikTok is not the place where you should be getting information. However, I still hear grown adults tell me about, like, oh, well, this is how everybody feels. Well, how do you know that? Well, all the TikTokers are talking. TikTokers are not a place to get your solid information. What it is a place for is to gain a hand or some sense of what people are thinking, what the common person is thinking. And there's value in that. There's value in being able to have a gauge on what most people are talking about, how some people are thinking about things. What is the conversation at the dinner table? But that's what TikTok is. That's not where you should go for your information or to say like this is truth, or to give you any of your news. But it can bring your attention to some things that you can then go and do some more research on. But I think about that again. I think about like, if I can look at TikTok as, is it starting to reflect something different? Is my attention now shifting the metrics, shifting the algorithm to show me a different reflection of how I've attended to something diverse or a different perspective? And what does that look like on a larger scale when it comes to information seeking?
Yeah, that's amazing. And it's a great also segue into our bigger topic of diversity, which can mean a lot of things in this context: diversity of opinion, having diversity of identity of the people that you associate with in any number of factors, and just disagreements about any number of topics not related to your identity, just your perspective on any number of topics. And with thinking about that diversity, I would love it if you guys had examples from your own lives of ways that you have benefited from having different perspectives of all kinds represented in your life, and maybe how you came across them when you wouldn't normally in your everyday life. Or how have you built your everyday life so that you do come across more diverse perspectives and people?
Maybe I'll take a shot at this. So many really good thoughts. Thank you all. To your question, Jenny, around how have I intentionally tried to build diversity. Part of it was moving to Newburgh, where I'm surrounded by a lot of difference in my most immediate community and whatnot, which I say somewhat in jest, but I say somewhat intentionally to maybe disrupt how we tend to think about diversity, right? I think the sort of connotation that comes alongside diversity is usually sort of narrowed down, right, to race or ethnicity, or like specifically people of color. And so I appreciate, Jenny, your reframing, which is to say diversity can describe a multitude of ideologies or theologies, or any number of social identities, right, things like this, right? Diversity is and needs to be broadened. And so I appreciate your reframing. As it pertains to information, one of the things that struck me in sort of going back to maybe the initial question around information wilderness and using that metaphor, rightfully so, I think we're critiquing and calling out the problematic nature of algorithms that are shaping what we read or what we see or what we watch. I'm sure I'm not the only one that really only like goes to the top 3 lines of my Netflix scrolling thing. For those of us that have the privilege of access to Netflix, it's like, I don't need to go down all this stuff. Like, just show me what I want to watch. Tell me who I am, right? Ends up being how it plays out. But when I think about wilderness, maybe using a more asset-based lens. When John was talking earlier around gatekeepers, that's 100% true, right? Historically, and this again connects to diversities, you've had folks who are the gatekeepers, right? So information or credible, legitimate information has historically been through journals, right? Or peer-reviewed journals, or things like the encyclopedia, right? That lend itself to credibility. And if you break that down, though, the question is, okay, well, these are journals that have editors and peers that are reviewing one another. And there's a legitimacy to it. I'm an academic as well in a PhD program, so I understand there's a lot of attention paid to the creation, quote unquote, of knowledge, rightfully so. I think what we're starting to see, though, are folks that are saying, well, my knowledge and my truth, based off of my lived experience, is also valid and credible. Right. And so I think I find myself, especially as I'm thinking about information within the context of diversity, is questioning the education that I received that has told me consistently, oh, these are the legitimate forms of knowledge. These are the truths that are real. These are the truths that are credible. And be in a position where I can say, well, how might that be different, right? What may be the forms of knowledge that someone who's lived their entire life, right? What may be the forms of knowledge that they hold that you're not necessarily going to find in a peer-reviewed journal, right? Or to Brian's comment earlier, in an encyclopedia, because historically some populations have not had access to spaces where their knowledge becomes canonized in, you know, in an encyclopedia. And so I think there's a really cool opportunity that we're seeing, you know, whether it's through podcasts or blogs or folks literally around the world, again, who would have never historically been publicized, right, in journals, that are now having a platform to use their voice to say, this is my experience and it's valid, right? Now we have to use wisdom, of course, right? But I get excited when I think about how we get exposed to diversity in the broad sense because of the increased access to the marketplace, right, or the public sphere as technology has grown, right? So maybe there's a little bit different of an answer that you're looking for. Again, I concur with all of my peers and colleagues on this panel, and you know, I think from more of an asset-based lens, I think there are really cool things that we're beginning to see in, you know, the sort of sphere of information because of increased access.
I also think, just on the topic of gatekeepers, like in many respects, the gatekeepers emerged and became more solid as a result of the Industrial Revolution. But the dominant way the information was spread initially, which is why we ended up having a post office and why it was a big enough deal that it was like mentioned in the Federalist Papers and things like that, was because of the need for everybody to have access to newspapers. And citizen journalism was the dominant framework that you had for years. And what you did have was, there were voices that were not mainstream, that were considered radical, that we now all view as the truth, right? So the abolitionist movement came from citizen journalism, right? So like, I love that thought of saying, what are the benefits of this? Let's take an asset-based view. If the gatekeepers are gone, what do we gain from that? Because I love that. There's great podcasts, there's great news sources, there's amazing things. There's some real positives to that.
I know I really appreciate hearing from so many different voices out there in the world. You know, we can kind of poke fun at TikTokers, but like you said, Bryce and then John, the podcasters, someone with their own blog can have an international audience. You know, and a few decades ago, that's just not a possibility. So I really enjoy seeing that rich diversity of culture, ethnicity, demographics, financial well-being, international, just different perspectives. In an earlier life, I was in the military as an enlisted guy, and just had my eyes really open to people from different parts of the U.S. For one thing, I was the one white kid from Oregon, and everyone just always assumed I ate deer meat and potatoes. I'm like, that's not even Oregon, that's Idaho, potatoes. But I was kind of, thrown into this stereotype, and I was also one of the few Marines, I think, that didn't drink beer, just for personal reasons. And so I was the weird guy in a lot of ways. And it was really interesting to be on the other side of that coin for once in my life. And I know it's nothing compared to what others go through, but it was very eye-opening. And the thing I tell my students currently, I try to remember every semester is, according to my belief system, we're all created in the image of God, right? And all of us are blessed with many different wonderful varieties and facets of the Creator. So, seeing all that rich diversity, hearing that rich diversity in modern times is such a blessing. Where, again, a few decades ago, it would be whatever that newspaper published or whatever that encyclopedia editor decided was worthy, and we would never have heard the other side of many of these conversations. I'm so thankful for that these days, which again is due to that internet thing, which is also a big cowpath in my earlier terms, right? So that's my thought on that.
Can I say one thing real quick also about diversity? I'm trying to look it up real quick because I do not want to butcher this parable. Oh gosh, I should have done it before I started talking. But it's something to the effect that here it is. It says, until the lion learns how to write, every story will glorify the hunter. Right. So again, when we talk about information, or we talk about history, or we talk about really like broader meta narratives that are informing what we believe, how we believe, who we believe. Right. I also think about it in terms of power and history. Right. And so in some ways, this parable speaks to the history of power and who has been given the opportunity to craft narratives that end up being adopted as truth. Right. So an example that comes to mind for me in high school is taking AP US history. And our teacher, as we were learning about World War II, the first thing we read about World War II were some of the stories that came out of folks that were living in Hiroshima. Right. I had the advantage of living in Los Angeles, California, and in downtown LA, right? You have access to I think it's called the Japanese National American History Museum, which is created to provide narratives, and specifically counter narratives to these dominant stories that we believed around who Japanese folks were, who Japanese folks are. And so I bring that up because as I was learning about World War II, what some folks had learned is like, oh, we dropped the bomb and this was the bomb that ended World War II. It was the greatest thing, right? Nuclear war. We're able to show our power as Americans, and this is all great. I learned through a different story that showed the incredible pain and the incredible trauma and the generational effects of what the atomic bomb caused, right? So again, we think about diversity in information. I always have to consider power and how power is playing out, because I think too often, I think we assume whatever information we're absorbing, whatever stories, whatever narratives that we're taking in and believing is true are the only truth. Right. And I have to consistently be doing the work of understanding, well, who's telling the story, from what perspective, for what purpose, and how might I benefit from hearing the stories and narratives that have historically been left out, have not had the power to push their stories out. Especially, and Brian, I appreciate you mentioning, faith and this idea of the image of God. Like I particularly feel called to consider the narratives of the poor, of the marginalized, of the vulnerable, right? So who are the widows? Who are the imprisoned folks? And how might we need to position ourselves in such a way to hear those stories, especially if they cause us to become uncomfortable, right? Or disrupted, because I believe in a God and a Jesus that's consistently disrupting us and causing us to be uncomfortable, right? This is the Jesus that says, let your father, right, let your people bear their own, come and follow me. I'm like, nah, I want to sit here, like, be with my people and my family. But Jesus says, my story, right, is consistently disrupting those that are comfortable and consistently bringing comfort to those that have been disrupted by this system, right? So those are the stories when I think about diversity that I have to continually seek out. What are the stories of those that have been disrupted and uncomfortable, and how might I hear the voice of God in those stories, if that makes sense?
Amen, Bryce. That's fantastic. That's fantastic.
Yeah. So sorry to cut you off, Brian, but I think that's a great way to move into thinking about strategies. How do we actually do this? We've been talking a big game about both the challenges of engaging with information in this age, that there's everything. It's suited exactly towards us. We're only seeing our own perspective, yet at the same time, the internet is this double-edged sword that brings all of these other perspectives that we desperately need to see, that are available to us in a way that they have not been available to us in the past. So do you guys have any practices or strategies that you have found effective in kind of navigating those balance of things? How to kind of redeem the internet as a Christian, and how do you do that in a way that you can kind of bring other people into it and not necessarily just be overrun with skepticism and cynicism, and figure out what it is that you should trust that you find out there? And also, just a reminder to everyone, if you have questions for our panelists that you'd like them to address in the last couple of minutes, you could start putting them in the Q&A now. You would have been welcome to all throughout. But all right, now whoever would like to take that, maybe John, would you like to start with that one?
Sure. So a couple strategies one strategy is, I think it has to begin in the physical world before it even moves into the internet, right? And I think we can talk about silos as if they're new. I grew up in the biggest silo ever. You know, it was a small Southern Baptist church, right? It was very siloed. So where truth was so narrowly defined that like I couldn't accept the truth of evolution, like that was off the table, like that, you know. So I think we have to recognize that, like, one strategy is being very deliberate about seeking physical face-to-face community. This is funny during COVID, but for me, it's like we made a strategic decision, my wife and I, when we got married, that our primary community is going to be our neighborhood and not our church. Like, church is where you go to hear some ideas, to learn, and certainly where we go to serve. We met each other at church. But for me, my primary community will be my physical neighborhood, and being strategic about where you live so that diversity is there in terms of, you know, cultural and ethnic and linguistic diversity, but also in terms of ideological diversity. And I think that makes a huge difference, because people say crap online that they would never say face to face, right? So I think that, you know, saying the body of Christ is anywhere that people of faith come together, and that includes the neighborhood, you know. So for us, like, that's our primary community, and so that's one strategy. The other thing I'll say is, you know, I taught my 8th grade students this 5-step process of critical consuming, and I have a whole sketch video. I'll post it, but anyway, it's for middle schoolers. However, I use it with my graduate students too, because we need that reminder of critical consuming, that the goal should be to read less, but with more of a critical lens. And it finally hit me about 2 years ago that the issue isn't the skill and strategy of critical reading. It's that critical reading is a habit of the mind. And it's making that a habit that's the real struggle. It's saying that Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or TikTok might be entertaining and they might feel like an escape, but they are not going, they are, those places will never be socially or politically neutral, right? And they shouldn't be. There's no place that's socially or politically neutral, right? However, as a white man, it is very easy for me to view those spaces through like this white noise filter, where I forget and I just start viewing the space as neutral, and I fail to address injustice, or I fail to address key perspectives, or it's way too easy for me to slip into that. So I would say having the process is a part of it, the strategy, but the bigger piece is having that mindset and that habit. And I don't know how, if it's a struggle for me, I don't know how to get students to make that an everyday struggle. Or sorry, everyday habit.
Sorry, I feel like I'm taking up space, but I also don't do well with silence, so I tend to take it off. So this is me. Amber, do you want to go before I go again? You should go.
I can go. I don't have to. Yeah, I think that that's really good, John. I love the idea of thinking about this more broadly about how do we take this out in our life, right? How do we think about this more broadly than just academic information that we're taking in, but the exposure to the types of information and the ways in which we're doing that, both in our community, in our neighborhoods, to you know, the social media, to all of these other things. So thinking more broadly about that and how do we do that in our everyday life. And for me, one of the things that I think about, and along with what you were talking about, John, and what Bryce is saying, I've been talking a lot about the concept of like colonization and decolonization, and that using that as the framework too of that we have become so used to a certain perspective and that it's really easy to reject things even if we see value in it. It's easy to reject it as not truth or incorrect or wrong because it doesn't fit what we're used to. Where it doesn't fit this specific perspective, even if it's not my perspective, but it's what I've grown to know and accept as the right way, or the right way of understanding and knowing things. And so in my daily and regular practices, even catching myself of, as I'm reading something, doing that same critical thinking of how can I critically think and acknowledge and see, like, where are there values that are embedded in this information, whether that's, again, a social media post, a meme, an academic journal that I'm reading. What are these values that have been placed in here as normative, that have not been identified, that said, like, well, this, can we say, like, did we acknowledge that this research was done on all highly educated white students in America, and we're now trying to take that and say, this is how we understand human behavior? Well, that can't be how we do it, but it is. This is how we do it. This is how psychology is. My own criticism of my own guild, right, from psychology, that most of our research is done from a U.S. and Western perspective on students that are in college and are predominantly white, right? It's a very specific perspective, and then we're trying to take that and then generalize it to everybody and say, this is how we understand you. And so part of my own practice is starting to do that critical thinking of saying, like, what are the assumptions and values embedded in this information that I'm taking in that have not been identified, that have not been voiced, that have not been brought to the forefront of, this is how it's being filtered, what it's being filtered through, what are the lenses it's being filtered through, so that I can name it and then I can see it and I can then tease it apart and say, like, this doesn't mean that this is incorrect. It just means that it comes from this perspective, and maybe it's true for this perspective. And how can I understand this, or how can I shift this to make room for other perspectives? How can I shift this or add to this and find information that is that takes those things into account or is written from another perspective? But if I don't give voice to that, kind of like, again, back to what Bryce was saying, until the lion learns how to speak or write, we're only going to hear from the hunter's perspective. And I even go back to, like, other cultures who their history is done from, oral history, right? And if that hadn't been written down, or if there isn't these, in some families and cultures or tribes, that their history's been gone because it was an oral tradition and we've lost those things, it doesn't mean that their perspective is less valuable. It means that we have to do the intentional work to see when and where we've missed that, and we've allowed a kind of quote unquote colonized perspective to be the norm, and to determine what I'm accepting and what I'm rejecting. And so doing that, like, even in my day-to-day interactions, right? Like, where have I allowed, like, a specific perspective to guide what I've said to somebody, right? Like, what I've said to somebody about what it means to be in academics, like how you have to present yourself and how you should talk or dress or think, what you should say, what you should accept and not accept. How have I allowed a certain perspective to come in and determine that is something that maybe, again, isn't my personal value, but something that I've internalized as just normative without questioning it.
Yeah, thanks, Amber. That gives me a lot of food for thought, kind of thinking about what you said and thinking about my own strategies where I'm attempting to do a good job with this, or better job. I do try to find, and I'll pick on politics because it's easy, but I'll look at the very conservative, the very liberal, but also the international news website from different countries. I've been very fortunate to have had doctoral studies with a very diverse international group of researchers up at Oregon Health Science University from other countries, and through all the politics in the past many years, even just the state of the world in general, just seeing what other cultures and societies are saying about what's happening in Oregon with wildfires or with the coronavirus response or presidential elections. I mean, there's all kinds of can of worms we don't want to open right now, but just getting all those perspectives and using them all and seeing, what is common through those stories from all those different perspectives. What does make it through the filter? And maybe there is some kernel of truth that did make it through all those filters. That might be a decent place to start, and then I kind of work back out towards those very filtered impressions. And I've encouraged my wife, my kids, even my own students in certain classes to just consider those other sources and really go and intentionally seek out those other voices that you wouldn't normally encounter. And then again, just make your own opinion. Don't just, again, heads down that cow path of information that you're kind of just in unless you pull yourself up out of it. I've tried to do that for myself, and I've tried to encourage that behavior in others that I have the ability to do so with. And I think it's easy for me to do too, kind of in the EHS building with other scientists, look at everything. It's frustrating to hear from the science side about, studies that are peer reviewed that do only have a certain sample of a population and it's being considered representative for all mankind. It's bogus, right? And working with the National Institutes of Health on things, they very much care about, do the enrolled subjects in this study for a new drug trial or a new intervention or a new diagnostic technique, are they representative of the world in general? Are they representative of the Portland metro area? You've got to account for financial factors, access to healthcare, all kinds of things, and that's just kind of a recent trend in science, right? And it's very unfortunate, and I think people are just finally starting to realize that, oh, right, we're not doing things that are representative of everyone. We need to get these broader perspectives. So one of my strategies in a nutshell is just to seek out those alternate viewpoints, different lenses that people have filtered the same information through. So I appreciate what you said. It makes me just reaffirm to myself that I need to do better about that myself too.
That's spot on. And yeah, relatively quickly, seek out alternate viewpoints is huge. I would also, again, for me, it's going back to looking at like power and position, right? So it's understanding, whose perspective, right, has historically been valued. And how might we disrupt that to a degree? One of the things that people said multiple times in different iterations that I want to make super clear is there really is no neutral, right? I think John has said something there's no politically neutral. Anybody who would have you believe that they're being politically neutral is just straight out lying to your face. There's no neutral, in my opinion. It's a very objective, neutral opinion, right? See what I did there. So usually when I'm one of my strategies is trying to ask myself this question that I learned my senior year of undergrad. It's probably changed my thinking more than any other question, ever. And that question is, what is it doing? Right? The reason why I say there's no neutral is that something is always doing something, meaning what is this meme doing? What is this article doing? What is this video, this podcast, whatever form of media or information, what is it doing? What are the effects? If I want to put it within a theological space, how does this tell me about the tree in terms of what fruit is it producing? Right? And then ultimately allowing that to inform what I do with it. Is this an edifying piece of literature? Is this something that's causing me to move towards the oppressed, to move towards those for whom Jesus would move towards? Or is it perhaps causing me to move away from or to reinforce my own sense of power and comfort? And again, theologically, how do I wrestle with what this information is doing? And ultimately, how is it either drawing me toward the people that Jesus would cause me to be drawn towards, or is it causing me to pull away from, right? That becomes a question. What is it doing, right, is my one strategy. The second strategy is thinking about this idea of embodied knowledge, right? I've really come to believe that an embodied knowledge, right? Like the knowledge that we have because of who we are and the experiences we've had, right? In our racialized beings, in our gendered beings, right? In who we are, that gives us knowledge, right? And I sit there because I know I've gotten quite a bit of trouble sometimes when I think that either what I've read or seen or listened to has allowed me to have knowledge that someone who's lived that is some way less than. So a good example, early on, like 18-year-old Bryce, I used to get in a lot of trouble talking around gender, for example, because I'd be like, oh, well, you know, like women, and then fill in the blank. And then I'd be talking to this woman and she'd be like, yeah, that's not true. And I'd be like, no, like this is true. And she's telling me, she's like, no, like I've lived this experience and I'm telling you it's not true. And I'm like, yeah, but I read this book. I read this article. In fact, I know this feminist, right? I have my one feminist friend. And so I end up relying on that information that gets me in trouble, right? So there's a sense of humility and deference to someone whose embodied knowledge is speaking, right? So to be explicit, I've had plenty of people tell me like, Bryce, I have a black friend that told me it's okay to say the N-word. And I'm sitting here, and this is like usually a white person. I've never heard a black person say, I had a black friend who told me it's okay, right? And I'm sitting there like, nah, look at me in my face. I'm telling you, this is not okay, right? Also, when I talk about racism I've experienced, this is my experience. This isn't like from an article or book. Like I need you to believe me and trust me that what I'm saying is true, right? So deferring to the lived experiences of people, I think is important as we're trying to use strategies to navigate, right, the informational wilderness. How do we defer to the lived experiences of people and believe them when they're telling us things, especially if we haven't lived those experiences, right? I think is a very, very important strategy.
I just want to say absolutely. I totally agree with that. That we have to. I think that there's a piece of this of being able to value the lived experience, right? And not to dismiss it, even if there are books or articles or things like that, that we need to believe and trust the person that is their experience, and that is a value. And again, when we're thinking about information, that what does it mean for us to be able to accept multiple truths? Right? As a Black woman, what is my lived experience as a Black woman in the Pacific Northwest does not mean it's going to be analogous to somebody else's as a Black woman in the Pacific Northwest. That we can have two very different lived experiences and even come to different conclusions about what that means. And both can be true, right? That what does it look like and what does it mean for us to integrate the both and to integrate academic knowledge and integrate the information that we get from reading and stuff, as well as embodied experiences and lived experiences, and being able to say both are true, and it's not saying that one is more or better than the other, while still accepting and say, yes, this is truth and this is truth. And how can we accept that kind of duality and the multiplicity of what truth is, given context and experience and lived and the embodiment of one's life and experience.
Well, thank you all. That's so helpful. But before we get to a very, very quick Q&A at this point, I just wondered if you guys in one sentence could sum up kind of an encouragement or final thought to students as they go and do this challenging work that none of us have mastered yet, but are all working to do. How will you encourage our participants as they go out to do this work?
I would say briefly, don't let your heart be hardened. You have a soft heart. I really like, Bryce, what you said about, Jesus. I kept thinking when you were talking about Jesus, the rebel Jesus, disruptive, go against the status quo, hear from those unheard voices, the poor, the powerless, all those things.
Yeah, I'd go back to, like I said, just that question, thinking about what is it doing? What work does it do? What is the fruit of what you're reading, listening to, and is that fruit that you feel comfortable also perpetuating?
I would say to remember that seeking diversity and truth, and in your media landscape, however you take it, navigating that wilderness, is inherently an act of worship, right? And I say that because I love Amber mentioned like the both and aspect, and God is, through the Trinity, inherently nuanced and diverse and paradoxical. That is God himself. And I think remembering that the Bible speaks constantly through the lens of power and oppression, and that loving God with your mind isn't purely cognitive, it's also itself an act of justice. And so I've always thought like the verse I lean toward in thinking about navigating the wilderness is Micah 6:8, right? So it's about seeking justice. It's about walking humbly. And if that happens, then I think that's the mindset that I would love for people to have as they think about the wilderness.
And I'd say I echo everybody's thoughts, and I just say as you're going out, to be intentional, to just be intentional about what you're doing, how you're engaging, to not be afraid. If we use the wilderness analogy, and my fear with the wilderness of, instead of being afraid, just going out and seeing like, how can I engage? How can I learn from this environment? Even if it's totally unfamiliar terrain, I don't know what I'm looking at, but being intentional about engaging with it anyway, and not being afraid of messing up either, or misunderstanding, but to just keep going and keep engaging and being intentional in the process.
Okay, that is so great. Thanks, Amber. I would love, is anyone okay if we go a couple minutes over for questions? I want to just say that we are at the end of our time, and so anyone can feel free to go. I know other people have other commitments that they might be tied to, and I want to respect that. But if panelists have maybe an extra 5 minutes, can you give me a thumbs up if that sounds okay to you? Okay, let's move to Q&A. Does anybody have a question for any of our excellent panelists? Quiet group, I see. All right, why don't you move to the next slide then, Kate? And I will say that if you did enjoy this panel, even if you didn't have questions, I would welcome you to join us for our second one in 2 weeks, where we will welcome Jameson Loop, Melanie Springer-Mock, and Jamie Knowling-Off to talk about the other side of information. So today we talked a lot about the information that we bring into our lives, and there we're going to talk more about the information that we put out as creators and Christians, and how we can also think about doing that side of it well. And I want to thank you all again for coming, and thank all of our panelists for their time and expertise. Have a nice evening, everyone.